So we will start with Professor Karel van der Toorn. And since I did not bring my page with me, my printed page, I will have to do it with a small phone. So excuse me. So Professor Karel van der Toorn from the University of Amsterdam. He studied theology and Semitic languages. Basically, I don't have to introduce him to you, but as you all know, he has published a lot on Elephantine, on religion in Elephantine, and lately he has published also two very important books about Papyrus Amherst, 63, which we were awaiting, and we are waiting for another. Where's Tony home? And we're waiting for your edition as well, right? And the second book, which was of great use, for me at least, Becoming the Diaspora Jews Behind the Story of Elephantine, from 2019. So I call you up to give your lecture about Persian imperialism and the religious imagination. Please.
Thank you, Donnell, who has, by the way, a wonderful name and who speaks excellent Dutch, and so he's able to pronounce my name exactly as it should be pronounced. Let me tell you something personal. In the mid-1990s, I experienced what, in hindsight, was perhaps, in my professional life at least, the most, or one of the most exciting years. I spent that year, the academic year 1904-1905, at the Dutch Institute of Advanced Study, which is a modest imitation of the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study. And that year I was in a group of people, and the group was entitled Religion and Magic, or Magic and Religion, I forget which one came first. Shaul Shaked was a member of that group, and there were a few, mainly Assyriologists, like Tzvi Abush was there, Mark Geller was part of the group, Franz Wicherman, I myself, of course, well, I'm an Assyriologist on the side, more like that, and there was also a cultural anthropologist, and it was a wonderful year, and that was due in no small part to the man we're celebrating today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. A man so gentle and civilized and loving, and at the same time interested in everything what the others did. I mean, this is rare in scholarship, in my experience, unfortunately. But it was a real joy working with them, and with him certainly, and it is a very fond memory of me. Now, Elephantine you mentioned, and you also mentioned Papyrus Amherst. Gad Barnea told me, if you could, do not speak about Elephantine, because we have a lot of people speaking on Elephantine, and the Amherst Papyrus is perhaps not such a good subject either. Okay. Oh, well, I took it like that. No, so I'm going to share some ideas with you that are they're very simple and very basic. And my promise to you is you will understand everything. And then you can decide whether you agree or you disagree. And we can have a discussion, because I'm certainly going to say some things that not everybody will like. So it's about Persian imperialism and the religious imagination of early Judaism I'm speaking about. So it's not about the influence of Persian religion. That is not what I'm going to speak about. I'm speaking about what the experience, the Judean experience of the Persian administration, being the province Yehud, what has it done? What has been the impact on the religious ideas, the religious concepts, and ultimately also on religious practice of Judaism? And some of that, I think, is a lasting impact. I'm going to focus on two things. One is the concept of the heavenly court, God amidst his companions, or his servants, I should say. And that will be focusing on the role of angels. And the second part will be on Torah and the relationship between Torah and Dat. Now, Dat is an Aramaic word, but it goes back to the Persian, as you all know, data, which is often translated as law. We can discuss whether that translation is the most apt. So first, the influence of Persian imperialism, the experience with Persian imperialism on the religious imagination, and in fact, I will be focusing there on the role of angels. So here you have a picture, nice picture of an angel. I'm going to the book of Tobit and to the figure of Raphael. You all know the story of Tobit, or more, actually it's more the story of his son, Tobias. Tobias, who goes from Nineveh to Ecbatana, and who is led by Raphael, who he mistakes for quite a long time for a distant relative by the name of Azariah. Then toward the end of the adventures of those two, the angel dispels his ignorance and he says, I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord. One of the 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord. Now, what I want to focus on is this theme of 7 angels before the presence of the Lord, or the glory of the Lord. We find another reference to these 7 angels in the first book of Enoch, which is, as you know, a compilation of different parts. And this is from the book of the heavenly luminaries that covers first book of Enoch, chapter 72 to 82. And that book, according to most scholars, is the oldest stratum of the first Enoch traditions and is likely to stem from the Persian period. Now here too, you find the 7 angels. They are not referred to as angels, but when Enoch is brought back to earth after a tour d'horizon of heaven that he has been given, then the 7 holy ones brought me and placed me on the ground in front of the gate of my house. So Enoch, of course, has ascended to heaven, and the 7 angels, who are here referred to as the 7 holy ones, bring him down after the tour of heaven. Let me see. Oh. Yeah, here we have Tobias and Raphael. I throw in a few pictures for good measure, so to keep you awake. 7 angels of the presence. You also find them in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, of course, when the 7th seal is opened. By the way, God, you wrote on the 7th seal, didn't you? A very nice thing, actually. Look out for it. So when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. It's one of the best verses of the New Testament. There was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Now these 7 angels return in other earlier Jewish literature, like Jubilees, where they are called the 7 angels of the presence. The idea is the same. You have 7 angels that have the privilege to stand before God and to have direct access to God. The 7th seal. Now, you can wonder, of course, why this figure of 7? There are 7 days in the week. Well, that's possible. There are 7 arms on the menorah that Zechariah speaks about. My suggestion would be that what you find here is a projection of the reality at the Persian court, or at least the reality of the Persian court as perceived by Judeans, projected onto the heavenly court. So I'm quoting now first two verses from the Hebrew Bible. One is from the Edict of Xerxes to Ezra. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra, for you are commissioned by the kings and his 7 counselors, Shivat Ya'atohi, to regulate Judah and Jerusalem according to the law, the Dat, we will return to that in a minute, of your God that you hold in your hand. Yep. In Esther 2, these 7 officials, they are called Sarim, return. The king consulted the sages, and those closest to him were the 7 officials. You get first their names, I skipped their names. The 7 officials of Persia and Media who had access to the king, who were seeing the face of the king, Ro'ei Pnei HaMelech, and sat first in the kingdom. So same perception, there is the royal king, that's too much. There is the king, the royal monarch, and his 7 counselors. You also find this in Greek tradition. They were the 7 of the noblest Persians, and each of those 7 was free, according to Herodotus, whenever he pleased, to enter the palace unannounced, unless, of course, the king were in the company of one of his wives. How they could know that, I don't know, but anyway. So the idea is the Persian emperor, the Persian king, is basically inaccessible, but for these 7 figures whom he consults and who have direct access to him. My suggestion is that what happened is when Judeans had the experience of the Persian Empire, they thought in a different way about their own God, because their God had to be, well, the highest position possible. And the highest position possible that they knew in this world was that of the Persian king, who was a world emperor. And in the image of the Persian king, the king, Yahweh, or whatever they pronounced, the God of heaven, he became, like the Persian king, the king of kings, or even, as in later Jewish tradition, the king of kings. He became a world emperor, a cosmic emperor. So what happens then in the whole mechanic of the presentation is that you get a different interpretation of what you had earlier. So the earlier situation was, let's say, under in the monarchic period in Israel and in Judah, is that you had Adonai amid the B'nai El, or the B'nai Elohim. There were other gods, but he was the king of the other gods, just like Marduk was the king of the other gods, and Baal was the king of the other gods. So there was supremacy, but they were still recognized as gods. They were B'nai El. They could also be called Kedoshim, but Kedoshim at that time was still referring to gods. What you see happening now in the Persian era is a demotion of these deities, and they become angels. They become Kedoshim, but angels of a different nature than the God of the Jews, than Adonai. And these angels, they become the mediators between the individual, also between the nation, by the way, but also between the individual and the deity, who is distant, far away, invisible, like the Persian emperor. And you need the mediation of angels, and especially, as we see in the book of Tobit, by angels of the presence. And this has to do with the different position of the Persian monarch compared to an Israelite king. An Israelite king ideally could still be approached by a citizen or one of those living in Israel or in Judah. I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, there are various stories where you see individuals complaining to the king, coming to the kings to redress their case, asking for a verdict or for a return of verdict. And of course, you could say these stories are, well, it's literature. It's literature. It's true. It's propagandistic literature also to some degree. Nevertheless, apparently, this was perceived as possible, as a possibility, that you could go to the king and that you would find audience. Now, in the Persian era, with the Persian emperor, that was completely impossible. It was completely impossible. We had that. Yeah, I have a quote here, which I have called "Inaccessibility is the prerogative of power." You could also say invisibility is the prerogative of power, or invisibility is the proof of power, whatever you want to make of that, the phrase that catches your imagination most. And this is a quote from Aristotle, referring to the Persian emperor. The king himself, so the story goes, established himself at Susa or Ecbatana, invisible to all, which is, I like this idea because it's so the opposite of our modern democracy, where people have to make themselves visible all the time in order to maintain the support of the population. But no, this is not. Real power is to be invisible to your subjects, to be inaccessible. Dwelling in a wondrous palace, it had many gateways, one after another, and porches, many furlongs apart from one another, secured by bronze doors and mighty walls. Some couleur locale of Persia, at the marble throne of the Golestan Palace. Now, I say that these angels, excuse me, these angels are mediators, and that is their position, and there are many of them. There are, of course, there are thousands and thousands of angels, not directly in the Persian period, but once this process started, they multiply. Also because they take, well, you could say they come as numerous as the stars, you know, and as the sand of the sea. Because of the demise of the old gods, well, their demotion. Also, I think because of a change in the role of ancestors, I think that the evidence for a continuation of the ancestral cult is difficult to find, in fact, Persian and Hellenistic periods. And what you get are angels, because ancestors could intercede before with the gods, just like Anat Yah, who could intercede with her husband, of course, or Asherah. But those are gone, and now we get angels. And the interesting thing is that this also has an effect on the way people think about communication between the deity and humans. So formerly, and this is the dominant idea in the biblical book of Psalms, you cry out loud to God. You can wave, or you can raise your hands, or you can make all sorts of gestures. You can burn, of course, incense, because that attracts his attention. But what you do hope is that your voice will come unto God. Let my voice come unto thee is one of those phrases from the Psalms that occurs time and again. Now, what you see happening in the later periods, and I think this is, in fact, an influence, a derivation of the experience with the Persian Empire projected onto the religion, is that prayer is seen as, well, the metaphor of prayer becomes that of a postal system. And of course, the Persians were known for their postal system, were much admired by the Greeks for their postal system. Now, if you read the book of Tobit, you find there's this, at the beginning of the book of Tobit, you have Tobit himself and Sarah. Tobit, he is in Nineveh, and Sarah is in Ecbatana. They pray simultaneously, without knowing that of one another, of course. And according to Tobit, chapter 3, verse 17, at that very moment, the prayers of both of them were heard in the glorious presence of God. Now, if you read that, you would think, well, that's the old conception, where you speak a prayer and it's immediately heard by God. But continue to read, and you get to Tobit chapter 12, verse 12, and you see, referring to this same event, Raphael is saying, so now when you, Tobit, and Sarah prayed, it was I, that is the angel Raphael, who brought and read the record of your prayer before the glory of the Lord. So Raphael is one of the 7 angels before, for the presence of the Lord. And actually what has happened here, there's a new conception of prayer, that prayer is spoken perhaps, but then it's written down, and it goes into the postal system, and it gets to the cosmic emperor, God, and is there read aloud in his presence by one of the 7 angels. I think this whole metaphor, because, well, it's a metaphor, of course, but this is inspired, or this derives from the experience of petitions to the Persian emperor through the means of messengers, etc. And of course, it's a two-way street. Ideally, communication goes in 2 directions, of course. With God, that sometimes might be difficult, but the law. I have here a quote from Josephus, and this is an idea, this is quite general, that you find in the Hellenistic and in the Roman period. The Greeks have declared heralds, and the word there is keros, which I have here in the singular, to be sacred, hieros, and inviolable, asylos, which has given our word asylum, of course, asylos, inviolable. And we have learned the noblest of our doctrines and the holiest of our laws through angels, angeloi, from God. This idea is also occurs time and again in the New Testament. I've just given you here one quote. The law, nomos, was passed on by angels to the hand of a mediator, and that mediator in this case is Moses, but it was given to him by angels. So it's a postal system in which the angels indeed are messengers, like malachim. Literally, they are the messengers, and they read aloud, or they bring also to earth. Now, this last quote brings us to the law, the Torah, and that is the second subject that I want to discuss. Daniel, I don't have a watch, but
You have 23 minutes.
oh, that's more than enough. More than enough.
22 then.
22 is also good. It's so simple. So the idea is here that I want to develop, or that I want to present to you, and I'm looking forward, just as in the first part also of what I did, is to see what you think about these things, because it's a very simple-minded way of reasoning, perhaps. But Torah is translated as dat, and we find that, of course, in Ezra, in the passage of the Artaxerxes edict, or here we have Ezra reading the law. By the way, it strikes me still that the law is presented there as the 2 tables by Gustave Doré. Wow. Anyway, so in the Hebrew, it is said that Ezra was a sofer mahir, an expert scribe, clearly not a fast scribe, but an expert scribe, sofer mahir, but Torat Moshe, in the Torah of Moses. This is it's equivalent, or more or less it's equivalent in the Aramaic edict, is Ezra is a scribe of the daad of the God of heaven. Oh, here we have the God of heaven again. Safar data di elash maya, and daad is, as I said, the translation or the loan word. In fact, it's a loan word from Persian in Aramaic. Now, what does daad mean? Well, we have Aaronists among us, and they will be able to say things that I cannot say because I am not very knowledgeable in these matters. But what I have done is I have looked at the use of datu, or datu shashari, which is Akkadian, but in Akkadian it's also a loan from the Persian, and the significance of those passages. And they are from the Achaemenid period, so they witness the transition from the old Babylonian system to the Persian system under the new rulers. Now there's a very good article on this, which I give here above. Christine Kleber, her name was mentioned earlier. So she wrote a good article, Datu Shashari Gesetzgebung in Babylonien unter den Achaemeniden, in which she surveys all, and this is 2010, but she surveys all the occurrences of the term. And one of the major occurrences occurs in what is noted there second, by Michal Jursa, and a name I cannot pronounce, and Caroline Waarzegers, whose name I do pronounce, because she is a dear colleague from Leiden, and 3 court records. And I'm going to show you one of these court records. So it's in Akkadian. It's barbaric Akkadian in my view, but nevertheless you can translate it quite easily. It's an amazing text. Watch out. So, Simager Udianu Kinachu. Simager is not a proper name, which you would be tempted to think, but it's the title of an official, Simager. The Simager and his colleagues, the judges, Kinatsu, well, we know that term also from the Aramaic of the Hebrew Bible. Dati iptui, ultu dati, erbita amelutu, inamuchi, so and so, parsanishu. So they opened the datu. It's not a plural. It looks like a plural, but it isn't. Dati iptui and ultu dati, which on the basis of or from the datu, they imposed on this individual a penalty of 4 slaves. So the story behind this text is interesting. This is a man who has appropriated a female slave belonging to someone else, arguing that she is his sister. And then there is a mash'altu, an interrogation, and he has to admit that she isn't his sister. And he simply has confiscated the slave girl of somebody else. And then he is fined to a penalty of 4 slaves. And this penalty apparently was prescribed in the datu of the king. There are other examples, but before we let me still stay with the datu of the king. I'd like to quote here the commentary by one of the publishers of this text, of this first text, and he says, and this is the commentary by Michael Jursa, a great scholar. He said, thus we may postulate the existence of a royal rulebook that is referred to as datu or as datu shashari for regulating different cases of dispute over the status of slaves. Christine Kleber also has a comment. She says, datu, he refers to a compendium, that's the word she uses, a compendium, that was consulted, opened and consulted to determine the correct penalty. So there's another example a little less explicit, but it's also it's somewhat similar. It's a matter of deposits. The Akkadian word for deposit is pakdu, and it is said it's also a court case. According to libu datu, according to the datu of the king, datu shashari, the judges made a verdict. The datu shashari sha'ina muhi pakdi shatri that have been written about deposits. So there is this written code, a royal code, a datu that is consulted and then used to determine the proper measures to be taken. Now, of course, you can read, I mean, you all know the literature on Torah, and you know that Torah that Torah originally was not law. Torah was instruction or teaching, and it could be given by parents, it could be given by school teachers, by wise men, it could be given by priests, of course. It was oral. People came to search, to seek Torah from the mouth of the priest, as the expression goes. What we find here is Torah becomes dat, and dat is written, and dat has the connotation, if we go by the evidence of the Achaemenid sources from Babylonia, of a companion of rules that are to be consulted and are to be applied. So how about Torah? On the one hand, the Akkadian word dinatu, I have here the Hammurabi stele. Hammurabi's laws, I mean that's how they are referred to, are in fact in Akkadian referred to as dinatu. Exemplary cases, or court cases, you might say, precedents. Dinanu is also a variant that you find for the same topic. And how about them in comparison with that? I would say that neither in pre-Persian Judah or Israel, for that matter, nor in Babylonia do you find this notion of a law code the way Roman law codes works, or the way Persian law codes work, apparently. So prior to Ezra, there is no instance in the Hebrew Bible where people consult the written Torah to establish the proper measures to be taken, and in Mesopotamia, likewise, the various law collections did not serve as legal codes to be consulted and applied in each and every case. No, they were there for the glory of the king, to glorify the wisdom of the king, and to hone the skills of judges. You know, they are instruction material, they're teaching material. And if you compare that to Persian data, Aramaic dat, and Akkadian datu, two loans from Persian, there it does refer to a legal code, a compendium with rules that judges are to consult and to apply. Now, when I was a student, I did study theology one day, and many years back, my teachers were telling me, don't translate Torah as law, because that's a mistranslation, that's a misunderstanding, and because that's not at all what Torah is. Torah is teaching, Torah is guidance, etc., not a legal code. And they blamed that mistranslation, that misunderstanding on the Greek, on the fact that the Septuagint had consistently, or quite consistently, translated Torah as nomos. Well, I think this judgment contains two errors. The first is a misrecognition of the fact that the nomos of the Septuagint had a precedent in the Persian interpretation of the Torah as dat, as evidenced in the Artaxerxes decree about Ezra's mission. And the second one concerns the very notion of mistranslation. It is true, of course, that Torah originally did not mean law, but instruction, teaching. In the Persian period, however, the Torah did in fact become a kind of law code. And how it practically worked out, well, we will hear a lot about this during these next 3 days, 2.5 days. But let me say this, that at least by the leadership of the province Yehud and by much of later Jewry, the Torah was indeed understood as a law code, and that had to be followed, that had to be consulted and be followed. And in this, they adopted in this way the Persian view of dat and applied it to the Torah. It was a new understanding of the Torah, but I would say it was the inauguration of a new phase of Judean religion, or early Judaism, and one that would prove to be extraordinarily fruitful. So to call that a misinterpretation or a mistranslation is, I think, a judgment value that we should not adopt. So, and here's a picture of my grandson. Okay, thank you so much.
Karel, thank you very much for these wonderful ideas. I would have a question for the last matter, the law. I mean, with the angels and the 7 court guys, I think that's quite clear what's going on there. With the law, it's maybe a little bit more complicated. So your thesis is more or less the same we read with Schäder and Eduard Meyer, who had the same idea as you just represented it on the basis of Esdra 7, of course. And the argument against them was always that actually we didn't know or don't know, and I'm not familiar with Iranian studies and so on. When I studied this subject in the 80s and 70s and 90s, the Iranian people said, so from Iranian studies, well, it is fine, but the term data, it's, I think, 1 or twice used in the Achaemenid inscriptions.
Oh, that's right.
But you have to interpret it. One in the Xerxes Daeva inscription and another one.
Right.
But actually they came to the conclusion there was no Persian law code.
No.
Never existed a law code.
Yeah.
So we have to think, if we want to keep this Schäder-Meyer idea, we have to think about the reception of the term in the cultures. So my question would be actually these wonderful 3 cases I didn't know there from Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
How did the Mesopotamians actually interpret the Persian data? Yeah. And how did the scribes of the Hebrew Bible, which are not, I mean, interpret this? Yeah.
No, it was a good question. And sorry, that sounds patronizing if I call a question good, of course. And yes, that's right. That's right. No, I think what I wanted to bring into the discussion was indeed the Babylonian evidence from the Achaemenid period. Because I understand that from an Iranian perspective, you could say there is no Persian law code and data does not refer to a law code. But what you find in these Achaemenid texts, and especially in this, of course, it's never so clear as is in this one text, where you open the datu and you go and look what applies to this case, and then you come to a judgment and you determine the penalty. And this is basically also what happens in the other case, although there it's less explicit, although they consult written datu shasharu. And the idea here is, in the past, scholars have often thought of this expression datu shashari as a one-time edict in very specific cases. There's a German word for this, Einzelfalljustiz or something like that. And well, I like to throw in German words from time to time, of course. But it's like many German words, It's an agglutinative language. But what these examples show you that there is something like, indeed, like a companion, or you might call it a book. The form is not clear because open that can apply to a scroll, but it can also apply to a ledger of wax tablets. But the underlying idea that there is, it's difficult to see this other than as a form of a code. And, well, as I say, I think that idea was adopted when, at some point, in the province Yehud, by the leadership there, who regarded the Torah as their dot, and consulted it. Well, when did that actually happen? Of course, I know you have your ideas about that, and I'm looking forward to hearing them tomorrow. But it is a transformation in the concept. And the point that I would like to make is that it is not due to Greek nomos, because you had dot before. And that's where the change already happened.
Thank you. Along these lines, I was wondering. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Along these lines, I was thinking the whole time of what sort of social context in which these Judean writers of these biblical texts would come into contact with this imagery, particularly the law imagery, and. It reminded me, of course, of not to bring it back to Elephantini, because he's not supposed to, but of course Vitaranga was at some point promoted to what the Persian word is always translated as the guardian of the seventh. And what I had discovered in my work on the religion issue was that I was surprised to see that I knew that the Persians had done something the other empires hadn't done, and it reached into the temples in a way that imperial administration hadn't done before. But these oath statements surprised me because it was clear that there was a priestly administrator who was trained in the language of the Persian legal system inside the temple, writing according to contractual law. So I'm wondering if we need to have a Persian actual law code, like a Hammurabi, or if we could have a body of Persian prescribed exercises that everyone has to learn, and this is seen as perhaps the law code of the Persians.
Right, and and it was called, it's not called the law code of the Persians, of course, because the standard expression is either Datu or Datu Shashari, the king, and that is, of course, very much in the tradition, in the ancient Near Eastern tradition. But the tradition nevertheless changes because it becomes a reference that is applied and that is consulted and applied. Now, your suggestion is very interesting, and well, I will think about that.
May I make a remark? May I make a remark? Do you hear me?
No, I don't hear you. I don't see you either because I'm looking into the light.
May I make a remark about the context of this data, of the date is very important, because we find the date of the introduction of this data, coincides with the appearance of collegia of judges. And every collegia consisted of at least 3 judges, sometimes more. And interestingly enough, we find among these judges at least one, sometimes the majority, with Iranian names. So this is not a coincidence. They probably brought them from Iran, from Persis. in order to introduce this law, this new law, this new code. And then there is also an official who appears is not quite common like the Akkadian word for judge, dayanu, but he appears, and not seldom he appears as data bara,
Yes.
data bara, the bearer, the bearer of the promoter of the data.
Yeah.
So these two phenomena probably have something to do with the code.
Yes, that's interesting. Thank you very much. I will.
Or maybe a written code, or to some extent people who spoke Persian and they were interpreters who could adjust the case to their own tradition.
I'd like to have the references.
Sometimes the databaras have Akkadian names or non-Iranian.
Yeah. No, that occurs also in Akkadian. Yeah.
In the question of Israelite religion and Judaism, or the Jews of Elephantine, or the Judeans of Elephantine, are you implying here that Judaism began in the Persian period and not in the Hellenistic period?
That's a tricky question. It depends very much on how you define Judaism is, of course, the answer. But that's a very dissatisfying answer to you, I understand. It's unsatisfactory.
So you would say that Judeans...
No, can I finish my thought?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the book I did write on Elephantine that I'm not supposed to speak about. I defended the use of the term Jews, so that is in the Persian period, because it is my conviction that the term Yehudi, where the plural, is also applied to non-Judeans that were from Samaria and other places. So in that sense, you get a development towards a not strictly ethnic designation. It becomes, well, I don't think you could say it's a cultic designation, but or a religious designation, but it is broader than just Judeans. And now, if you say, when do we find Judaism in the sense as a Torah-centered, broadly popular Torah-centered religion, that is not in the Persian age, that is later. But that's a different matter. And so, how would you like to define Judaism?
That's what I'm asking you.
Well, I think both. If you define your terms, and if you say, when I applied the term Jude, I avoid the term Judaism, but Jews I did apply as a term, explaining that I was looking for a term that included both Judeans and Sumerians. And
In Esther meet Yahadim.
Excuse me?
In Esther meet Yahadim.
Yes.
How do you explain meet Yahadim? Pretend to be Jews?
Behaving like Jews?
Behaving like Jews?
Yeah, I would say so. Now, of course, this also is the date of Esther, but yeah. There was a question of Conrad, actually, or maybe he forgot his question.
Thank you, Karel. You explained the more descriptive than normative nature of ancient Near Eastern and biblical law convincingly, and you said up until Ezra, somehow we don't have any evidence that these laws laws or regulations were applied in any technical sense. And now I wanted to ask about Ezra, whether somehow even Ezra is really a line where we can be quite sure. So 2 questions. First is, are you speaking here of the biblical Ezra, the biblical presentation of Ezra, or if there is such a person, the historical Ezra? This would be the first question. And the second one is, if we look at the text like Nehemiah 8:5-8, where Ezra is actually being described as somehow applying the law now, this is more like a religious act, and somehow the regulations are explained and interpreted, and so on. So the question is really somehow, is even Ezra, so to speak, the dividing line?
Yeah, no. Well, I wrote down Nehemiah 8, verses 13-18 as an example, and also Ezra 10, verse 3. But that's, of course, literature. It's biblical literature, and I would stay away from the question whether that was historically indeed true, but I think that is the concept that underlies these texts. And the interesting thing, actually, this is also true for the question of angels, is that what I perceive as the impact of Persian imperialism on the religious imagination actually begins to really flower in the Hellenistic period. So I think you have to trace the lines back to the Persian period, and that is the ferment that brought it about. And the case of the angels, I think, is quite clear. And, well, to my mind, this understanding of Dhatu as a collection of laws is also quite clear. But it is true that it only begins to bloom and to expand, that the angels in numbers begin to expand with different functions, and personal angels, etc. That's all Hellenistic and Roman. And this is also true, I suppose, for much of the use of Torah in the sense as a Dhatu or a Namas. Yeah.
We actually have a question from online.
So one of the Zoom people asked if you can see a connection between the 7 angels that you mentioned and the 7 demons who guard the entrance to hell in Mesopotamian literature.
Ah, that's an interesting question. I had not thought about it. And that's an interesting question. Because, of course, you have 7 layers of the underworld, 7 gates to the underworld, and 7 gatekeepers of the underworld. And you also have 7 heavens, which, I mean, this is a parallel image, of course. That would... It's a different construction, though. I mean, you have the figure 7, and the figure 7 is clearly used more often, but I don't see how you could get from these gatekeepers, whether it's in heaven, or there are also gatekeepers in heaven or in the underworld, to these 7 angels or 7 demons. Well, no, I think well, to me, the more convincing explanation would be to say, no, this is a projection of a human reality as perceived by Greeks and by Judeans of the Persian court. Now, I look at you, but of course I'm looking at the invisible questionnaire.
So one last question. Yeah. Thank you very much. The connection between this Babylonian, Mesopotamian text and the Torah is very interesting. But does it really mean that the Jewish or the Jewish side understood Torah as data? Because in Babylonian they called it data, especially since this term data went into religious language in Aramaic and Hebrew, meaning religion and
absolutely
and numbers. So there's they have this taken over this term, but not in this meaning.
Well, I think that the meaning of daad as religion is a later development and is due to the prominent place of the law. I mean, the law becomes my religion. And that's not just for a lawyer, but that's for people. And indeed, yes, of course, in modern Hebrew, somebody who is dati is a religious person. Yes, Arabic is another matter. Yeah. No. This is the whole issue that there is no word for religion, so they use the word for law as a substitute for religion, because they don't have a notion of religion before the Enlightenment. Well, some argue that, and I basically agree with that. Not as a separate province of human culture, divided from the rest. But temple is politics and economics, and all one game.
Okay, I will take the prerogative of the chair and add one thing.
And send me away. Good.
And yes, no, first I'll add one thing and then I'll send you away. I think it is in Herodotus and maybe also in Diodorus. Darius collects all the laws of Egypt.
Yes.
Of course, and that would be something similar. And if you say that, and if
yes,
you say that there is no Persian law, I get the feeling that what we have here is collecting all the laws of the countries, and working according to them as a compendium.
Yeah. No, it's thank you for reminding us of that, because those are important passages, and they have, of course, there's also Egyptian material that
without Elephantine, without mentioning Elephantine.
Without Elephantine, yes. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.